This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
And today we've got the big one, the one we're all really talking about. And I think I know I've been dying to talk about it for a long time. And that is Goodfellas, the most classic, legendary mob movie of all times. Does it live up to the hype? Short story, yes, it does. Let's dive into this incredible piece of film and history today on Beyond the Big Screen. I'm excited to be joined by none other than the possible reincarnation of Gemini crew member Chris Rosenberg, our own Mustache Chris. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty good myself. I'm pretty pumped to talk about this movie. Like you said in the intro, it literally is history. It's actually, I believe, in the vault of American history or something of that. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's like there's only been a couple of films that have actually been put in this vault, and Goodfellas is one of them.
Now, I highly suggest people go back and listen to the last episode on the Lufthansa heist, because that's a really big chunk of the background on this movie. We really get into the individual pieces of this movie, and we'll touch upon the history and the background, but we're also going to just enjoy this great movie. The first things first, though, Henry Hill is the main character. He was only in his mid-30s when he was finally arrested in 1980. Could you give us a little background on the main character, Henry Hill, who was played by the great Ray Liotta?
The late great Ray Liotta.
Yeah,
it's great. It still bothers me that he's not around anymore.
It hurts.
It does. Yeah, Henry was, he grew up in a poor part of Brooklyn. His dad was a union electrician worker, and he actually lived right across the cab stand, which is depicted in the movie. That's where Paul Vario and his brother and his crew, did a lot of their business. And Henry grew up kind of looking up to these guys because they didn't get parking tickets. They had fancy cars, fancy clothes. Everyone showed them a ton of respect. And he started to look down at people like his father and, the Joe Schmoes. And he just walks into the cab stand one day and, Paulie's brother hires him and he starts doing work. That's kind of how it starts.
Because really, Henry Hill, in the grand scope of things, when you think about somebody born in the 1940s, 1950s, his parents were on the way to the American dream. They were both immigrants, I believe, or, of fairly recent immigrant stock. His dad was a hard worker. His mom was a hard worker. I believe even some of Henry's siblings became completely legit. I mean, they were on the path to the American dream, but Henry just got sucked in his early teens. I mean, picture a 13-year-old becoming a runner for the Mafia. It's pretty insane to think about.
Oh, yeah. And he was doing, he was like driving caddies for them at one point. But then he was pretty early on. He was, selling bootleg cigarettes and, kind of low end crimes. I mean, there's a lot of money in bootleg cigarettes, up here in Canada. It's huge business. Like untaxed cigarettes. But yeah, it's crazy to think that him just starting so young. And that's one of the good things that the movie does is the young actor that they picked to play Henry Hill. He looks a lot like, he has like kind of Ray Liotta's eyes. And there was one thing that I kind of really liked that they did in the movie is they picked young actors that kind of look like the older counterparts.
Then they Paul Vario was in real life the boss of his family, and he was kind of He was a capo mid-range management, you might say, in the Lucchese family. In the movie, he's called Paul Cicero, and he's played by Paul Sorvino. Just an excellent job by Paul Sorvino. Maybe tell a little bit about the Lucchese family in general.
Yeah, the Lucchese family was actually one of the more, they're pretty much famous for not having any like huge internal problems, unlike the Bonanno family and the Colombo family, and even later on the Gambino and the Genovese family. But they were kind of like the blue collar family, right? They did a lot of low end stuff like carjackings, chop shops. They were pretty famous for smuggling cigarettes. And I get the impression they were kind of like the blue collar wing of the Gambino family. I know it's not, that doesn't fit perfectly, but the Gambino family and the Lucchese family were really close. Have always were. And yeah, that's kind of like I don't know, that's what they specialized in, were these low end blue collar crimes. They made a ton of money doing it though.
Yeah, I think the sense I got is that the Lucchese family did those things very well. The chop shops, the car stealing rings. And they, at that time, in that golden age of the mafia in the 60s and the 70s and the 50s, you couldn't help but not be able to make money doing that kind of crime.
Yeah, because it's crazy to think like now it's a totally different world. But back then people didn't really consider it a big issue until, the heists and the carjacking started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Like we got into it a little bit with the Roy DeMeo episode. Like it becomes a totally different story when the carjacking involves, international countries, and, we're talking like millions and millions and millions of dollars, and, people like picking out cars like, oh, I want a blue, say Toyota Corolla with the windows this certain way, and they'd be like, okay, yeah, go steal this car. It's a totally, when it gets to that level, then the authorities really have no choice but to start doing something about it.
Those cars, then, they were so easy to steal. In the Roy DeMeo episode, we talked about it. I think at one time they were ramping up to steal 20 cars a night or something. I mean, that's theft on an industrial scale. And by the time Roy DeMeo comes along, the police are getting wise to it. The feds aren't taking any garbage with that, with just letting cars go through with VIN plates that look like it's something that you made in your garage with like a soldering gun or something. Now, some of the things that really came to my mind, and I think first off the bat, because we didn't really get to talk about it much in the background episode with Lufthansa, because we were really focusing on more on the crime aspect of Goodfellas and of Henry Hill, but his family life, he seemed to more or less have as normal as could be when you're a career criminal family life.
Oh yeah, his relationship with Karen. That's like a mafia thing too, though, where like these guys, they live these criminal lives and they try to have like the nice family life at the same time. Lucky Luciano actually is like an anomaly in the sense that he never had any kids, if I'm remembering correctly. And one of the reasons he said he wasn't going to have any kids is because it just wasn't fair to the child, and it wasn't fair to the wife because of the type of life he's led. But for the most part, these mob guys tried to live two separate lives and try to keep everything separate. And, and you mentioned in the notes that we were making for this series is there is some similarities between Karen and Barbara in some ways. It's not as extreme, but I mean, you're the one who brought that up. Like, what were you getting at with that?
I think with both Barbara Kuklinski and Karen is that they both weren't of that mafia class. They weren't from the criminal class whatsoever. Barbara Kuklinski was from a middle class Italian American family. And then Karen was from probably an upper middle class Jewish family, maybe even, even a little higher end, like upper middle class Jewish family, and not in the criminal element at all. But then once they got sucked into that, I think Karen knew much, much more what was going on than Barbara, or at least Karen admitted. Karen knew that Henry was a criminal, but she kind of liked it. She kind of liked having the money. She liked being able to go to a show and being treated like a VIP. And I think she fell into that lifestyle very easily because it's, in a lot of ways, the perks of it are very nice. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
Oh, yeah. And there's a great scene in the movie that kind of depicts Karen accepting the lifestyle, and it's the tracking shot where they're going into the restaurant, right? It's like one of the most iconic shots in the movie, and you see Henry and Karen, and they're walking down the stairs, and it's like a 3-minute shot, and there's a lot of red lights, and they sit at their table. I've always kind of thought that was like Martin Scorsese using like symbolism and motif that Karen is willingly accepting going into, I guess you can say hell, but in this case, like caverns of the inner workings of the mob. Like she knows that Henry, she'll sit there in the movie, she said, and then even herself, like she was kind of lying to herself exactly what Henry was. I think that's like her accepting this lifestyle and, getting into the nitty and gritty, like she's going, downwards.
Wow, that's brilliant. I've watched this movie probably 20 times if I've seen it once, maybe more than that. And I never really thought of it that way. It really is her willful descent into hell.
Yeah.
At any point, she could have stopped it, but that it was too much. It was the temptation of it all. It was too much for her to withstand.
Yeah, it's like the temptation of the devil, right? I mean, and there's also another scene where they get married and Karen finally meets all the other wives, because that's, you find out, it depicts in the movie, and then through our research, a lot of these mob guys, that's all they hang out with is like other mob wives and other mob guys, because, I mean, really, who else are you going to hang out with? You can't hang out with normal society, really. You can like put on a facade, but you really can't, because you're, committing crimes and, murdering people in some cases and beating people up. You're not part of normal society. I mean, and that's also part of the appeal of the mob, is the fact that you're like in a society within a society, right? You're outside of normal society. Yeah. But back to my original point is she meets all the wives and she talks about how they look all kind of dirty and like their clothes are dated and their skin's not nice. And I mean, to me, I've always kind of thought that was like kind of a representation of the toll that the life takes on you. Like you fully embrace this mob lifestyle and it's physically manifesting itself on you. And if you watch the movie, you see Karen ends up becoming almost exactly like one of those women, right? She becomes like a drug addict and she starts looking haggard. And I just thought that was kind of a foreshadowing. And I thought it was, it's just a symbolism, a physical motif of what this life of crime does to you.
I think also for that scene where she's at, I think it was some sort of like makeup sales party that were popular at that time. I think that was also supposed to show that dichotomy that she still felt that she was from an upper class family. And that was just so foreign that you would go to a party and sell things to your friends, that the Lucchese family members, they weren't, like you said, they were blue collar. They weren't of the same social class and social standing that a somebody from the Long Island suburbs, she was just from a different universe than a lot of those people were.
Yeah, and it's also they talk about in the movie too. A lot of it was cultural. Like Karen was pretty Jewish, right? Like to the point where Henry, when he first shows up to the house, he's wearing it's like a nice gold cross or what have you, and she's saying, "Oh no, cover it up," like she mentions her grandmother was fairly Orthodox, and it seems like the rest of her family took it very seriously. It's just it's one of those things that, so it's not so much of a big deal now. I mean, it still is, but back then those type of cultural differences were quite shocking to people.
Yeah, not only that was Henry Catholic and Italian Irish Catholic, he was also he was very working class. That's huge. What do you think though? Maybe I'm off base here. I think the movie let on, to me at least, that Henry at least kind of phoned it in that he was Jewish, that he, they had the Jewish wedding, but he actually converted to Judaism for Karen. And, he was at least nominally, he pretty much said that he was an atheist or even not care about religion. But that's a pretty big move for somebody to make, especially a mafia guy.
Well, I heard he got circumcised in his 20s, did he not, or something? When they got married, yeah. Like that's no small. That's a big deal.
Yeah, it's definitely not something. It's not something. I thought that it was the movie. It came across as casual, but that he made a pretty important life decision there.
Oh yeah,
which says, I think, speaks to his character, that he wasn't just somebody who was a user of people, even though in a lot of ways he was. I mean, I think he legitimately loved Karen, and I think he was a lot more of a normal person than Richard Kuklinski, for example.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like Henry, and you can't really compare the two in terms of I guess Henry was abusive like Richard, but in a different kind of way, where Henry would just cheat all the time and then lie to Karen about it. But Karen kind of accepted it later on. Yeah, but even in comparison to, Karen mentions it, Henry tended to treat the women in his life a little bit better than the rest of these mob guys did, even within their little small circle.
And you can't, in a way, I think what Henry did was he took the mafia standard of the guma, they call them, their girlfriend. And most of the mafia guys had long-term girlfriends that they would have almost in parallel with their wives. But Henry would have two gumas and move from one to the next, and he would almost throw it into Karen's face, which was even scandalous in the mafia, because I think you get back to the mafia with everything, a scandal or anything is that going to bring more heat on us? And Henry just got so careless with his girlfriends and with his drugs and with everything that it was bound to bring heat onto the mafia.
Well, even to the point where Paulie and Jimmy have to sit down and talk to him and be like, you have to cut it out, guy. You got to go back to Karen. I can't have her acting all crazy around, wherever Paulie was living at the time. It's causing problems. And because like a family, like a large family, if Karen's going around freaking out about Henry, then it's going to cause problems for the rest of the family, because who knows, maybe she says something, she regrets, or does something stupid and it calls attention to the cops, and it's just not a good look.
Then one other major thing that I thought we could talk about just because we didn't address it too much in the Lufthansa episode, is the whole thing of the murder of Billy Batts, who was really William Benventa. We talked about it a little bit, and I think it bears repeating because it's so crazy that Henry Tommy D. Simone, who was called Tommy DeVito, played by Joe Pesci, and then of course Jimmy Conway, who was played by Robert De Niro, that they were so psychotic to kill a made man from the Gambino family, and not only a made man from the Gambino family, John Gotti's partner. Like, what was wrong with them?
I would say greed and not following the rules, right? I mean, in Jimmy's case, like I did a little bit of research in this because that was always it's one of the more iconic scenes in the movie, especially De Niro's line where well, let's set it up. Like Billy Batts cracks a joke to Tommy about shining shoes, right? And it's just, he's giving him a little bit of a hard time, that Tommy takes it the wrong way and starts getting really upset about it. And then Billy's, he's had a couple of drinks, he's just got out of jail. It's like, well, I'm just joking with you, buddy. Fine, you want to be like that, and tells him to, bleep and shine his shoes or go get his shoebox or whatever. And Tommy freaks out. Yeah, Jimmy, Billy says, like, what's your buddy's problem? Like, I'm just having a little bit of fun with him. And probably one of De Niro's best lines in the movie is like, well, you disrespected him just a little bit. Just the way he says that line is awesome. Tommy is freaks out because he perceives that he's been, disrespected to the max. So he's not thinking straight. And then I did a little bit of research because I was wondering, well, why would Jimmy get involved in this, right? It doesn't make a ton of sense. But and what actually happened from what I've read is Jimmy took over Billy Batts's loan sharking book when he went to go do some time. And when he came back, Billy wanted it back, but Jimmy didn't want to give it up, right? Because greed. Jimmy didn't really need that book. He's making tons of money already. So this was like a kind of a convenient way of getting rid of him. Wasn't really well thought out. Tommy was pissed off in the moment. Jimmy wanted to not give up the book. Let's just take care of it. And Henry, from my understanding, was just not really involved in all of this. When he first opened up that restaurant, which was his restaurant, they talk about it in the movie. Like, Henry was trying to keep it legit. He wanted to just have a nice restaurant / bar because he enjoyed running restaurants and bars. And slowly over time, these guys started coming in. And obviously after this happens, the restaurant closes down pretty quickly.
So that really leads into what you thought of as the two major themes of the movie. And it's really the mafia going from its golden age and then to its collapse. And then the death of a family, which I thought that was really interesting, the take on it. So maybe talk a little bit about this whole idea of the mafia going from its peak to utter collapse, very close to utter collapse from the 60s to the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, throughout the course of the movie, like, it really is like a short history of the rise and fall of the mob in a lot of ways. Not so much the rise, but the downfall of the mob. Because at the beginning of the movie, it's everyone's making a ton of money. Everyone's having a good time. People are having drinks. They're joking around. And, the lifestyle seems appealing, right? Does it not?
Yeah, I mean, it's painted in a beautiful way, and the film really portrays it. It's all light, it's color, it's flash.
Yeah, and even like the actors look good, but as like the movie goes on, you start seeing the downfall of the mob, and it's depicted in Henry's narration too, but also just his life story and there's a couple of things, in my opinion, that kind of brought back brought the mob down was the influx of drugs. The drugs have always been part of the mob, but in terms of the people using it, and it's, beautifully acted by Ray Liotta, they start going crazy. They're not thinking straight, right? And then greed, which is kind of represented by Jimmy, where Jimmy was making tons of money. They all were, right? But people started getting greedier and greedier and greedier. And by being greedy, you create a negative feedback loop, right? Because people don't feel like they're getting their proper due. And it changes an individual too when you start getting into that level of greed. And if you read mob history, this is kind of what happened is certain individuals started getting greedier and greedier. We talked about it with Joe Gallo. Like if they had just paid Gallo properly, that the Colombo War probably does not happen. But people started getting greedier and greedier, and then people not following the rules, which is Tommy to a T, killing Billy Bats, and Henry talks about in his narration in the film and in the book too, where people just started whacking everybody, and nobody was really following the rules, and people weren't getting permission. And once those delicate rules start getting broken, made guys getting whacked without asking for permission, it's a slippery slope, and it starts happening more and more and more. And if you read mob history, this is exactly what happened. It started happening more and more and more. Like not people not only not asking for permission, but made guys just getting whacked, right? So the appeal of becoming a made guy and the whole delicate system that it's all built on starts crumbling down. If you look at the three main characters, they each kind of represent a different aspect of what brought the mob down, in my opinion.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. Yeah, that's it. That is really an important part of it, is that as the 70s rolled in, it got harder for those guys to make money easily. And then the drugs fall in their laps. It's such easy money so quickly and a lot of money. It plus the fact of what just drugs do to you, because they were all using too. It was everything that the old guys said. It happened, really.
I mean, Tommy is an example too of the type of people that were more and more so getting involved in the mob. Like Tommy was not a very remarkable person. I mean, in the sense of like, yeah, you'd probably want to have, probably want him to have your back in a fight or what have you. But I don't know much of anything else that I've read about him. He was not, I mean, we talked about in the Lufthansa heist, he took off his mask. Like, what were you thinking? Just like examples like that. And, like letting a joke get that out of hand, that you end up murdering a made guy of the Gambino family, a good friend of John Gotti's, in your friend's bar because you lost your temper. For a criminal organization to run properly, these types of things can't happen.
Then that theme of a family breaking apart. And if you pair the movie with the book Wise Guy, it becomes so clear that they were a family. Paul Vario knew Henry Hill since he was a kid, and Paul Vario was almost a dad, father to Henry Hill. And then it all falls apart. The one scene that really stuck out with me is when Paul Vario tells Henry Hill that he has to turn his back on him. And in real life, it was Paul Vario tells that to Karen. But then Karen says that Paul Vario was in tears. And I think that that's something that it's so hard to wrap, at least for me, to wrap my mind around, of how emotional it is. It's not just business. It really is family.
Well, yeah. And I mean, by the end of it, I mean, the Lufthansa heist is really what starts the downfall of the family. What should have been really the high point of of their existence ends up becoming the thing that tears them all apart. I mean, in a lot of ways, Jimmy was like an uncle to Tommy, and because he was older, right, to Tommy and Henry. And by the end of the movie, you have like father turning on sons, sons turning on fathers, uncles turning on their, cousins. And the whole thing is very tragic when you put it in the, within the mafia context. Henry's on the stand and he's pointing his finger at Paul Vario. I mean, in a sense, I can't really blame Henry, but I mean, that guy was pretty much your father in a lot of ways. He was more of a father than your actual father. I mean, and Paul Vario he came to the conclusion that he had to kill his own son. I'm sure that wasn't an easy thing to do. I mean, he did it to Tommy, but Tommy brought it on himself, and you just kind of see the implosion of this family. It's very sad, but it kind of shows you, and this is one thing that the movie does really well, is it shows you how people perceive the mob and what the mob actually is, right? And that's what the mob actually is. It's your best friend, the guy that you least expect whacks you. And why is that? Because you least expected that's who they're going to ask to do it.
Now let's shift focus a little bit and talk about what are some of the things that we liked about this movie. Now, I'm no film critic and I didn't go to film school or anything, but I think that the things that Martin Scorsese did, everything drew you in completely into this movie, from the filming to the soundtrack is unbelievable. The use of the montages, like you said, the setting the anticipation of telling the end first, every bit of it sucked me into this movie. And like I said, since this movie came out, I've watched it just countless times, and I enjoy it every single time.
Yeah, well, just like I'll go through some of the things that you said you like the soundtrack is iconic, right? And the soundtrack to me is key for the movie because it keeps the pace going. Where this movie is 2 hours and a half, but it definitely doesn't feel like it. It's just running through. I mean, Martin Scorsese uses like montages brilliantly, the way the whole movie is edited, because a lot of information comes across, but it's done relatively quickly, right? I mean, in some ways, watching this movie, it almost seems like he kind of invented the MTV style editing. I don't know how familiar the audience is with the that type of editing. It was like, I don't know, like it was big in the 90s, like kind of quick cuts, fast montages, and it started becoming like overdone, and it's overdone now. But in some ways, it almost seems like Martin Scorsese kind of invented it with this movie. I'm exaggerating, but one thing I think he did was groundbreaking with was telling the middle of the story, the end of the story, right at the beginning. With this movie, where you see them killing Billy Bats. I mean, we've gotten used to it now. Like, there's a lot of TV shows that kind of start like that and movies start like that, but I can't think of too many movies before this one that kind of started like that.
One other thing that to add to that is that I really liked how they used narration. It wasn't completely over the top where they're just telling me the whole story. It's basically an audio book, but they give the narration just at key points that gives you enough context and texture to understand what's coming up next. It carries you through, that you're never feeling dragging. And even if you start to feel like it drags a little bit, then there's that narration to pull you along.
Yeah. Yeah, and I usually don't like narration like that in film, but I mean, it's done brilliantly here. It's perfect.
And then my one last thing that I thought was really perfect was the cast. It was the perfect cast for that time. Age-wise, I mean, there was a really good mix of seasoned veterans with young people, like we see Michael Imperioli We see a really young Samuel L. Jackson playing Stax. But then you have, you had the really solid performances from Robert De Niro and Paul Sorvino. Joe Pesci was kind of up and coming. He wasn't peak at that point, but that's where I think you really got to know Joe Pesci, but it was just a perfect mix. And I think like if we were to compare that to The Irishman, which we haven't talked about yet, but he tried to bring that magic back together for The Irishman, and I think it didn't work where it worked perfectly in Goodfellas.
Well, you talk about the cast, and I think there was a lot of pushback and casting Ray Liotta, and Martin Scorsese like apparently put his foot down and was like dead serious that this is Ray Liotta's role. Because from my understanding, he hadn't really done much of anything. Like nobody knew who this guy was before this movie.
Yeah, I think he had done some minor stuff. I'm trying to think what he had done before those. That was really his breakout role, but he had done some stuff like Field of Dreams was before that. Dominic and Eugene, I watched it. It was kind of a strange movie with Tom Hulce, if you remember back to the 80s. But it wasn't Ray Liotta. Goodfellas made Ray Liotta.
Yeah, it really did, right? And I remember reading that there was a lot of pushback against that, and Martin Scorsese was like dead set that this is Ray Liotta was going to play this role. So obviously it was a good choice.
Now, what were some things that you really that stuck out to you that you really liked about this movie?
Like we talked about it, it does a really good job of showing the surface level, like all the glitz and glamour of the mafia, but it starts peeling the onions away, and it really does show you just how pretty grimy and disgusting it is. Like by the end of the movie, like Henry's face that's the mob, when he's all coked out and he's pale and looks sickly, and Karen looks the same way. I mean, that's the mob. This is what the mob does to you, And, Paulie wanting to kill his son in many ways, and Henry, and Jimmy turning his back on a lifetime friend over because he's afraid he's going to rat. I mean, it's not glitz and glamorous. It might appear like that on the surface, but me and you've done enough research on the mob now. This started off as a little short. We thought it was going to be a couple of movies, but it's became something so much bigger. And it's not glamorous at all. I mean, there's charismatic characters, there's interesting stories, but the lifestyle, it's not anything that I would wish upon anybody, to be honest with you. I really like the Henry and Karen, like the dynamic between those two. I think that carries the movie really well. We mentioned the narration. I thought which I typically don't like in movies. It's done very well here. I liked how it's, like I mentioned earlier, like it really depicts the truth about the mob, where, Henry has a line. It's usually your best friend is the guy that whacks you, right? A lot of these mob movies, they don't do a very, well, they haven't done as well of a job as Goodfellas in showing that, it's your best friend that's going to take you out. It's, I just like that it was really honest about that. Even in prison, there's this, Henry goes to prison, and everyone thinks there's this false narrative that, like, if a guy goes to prison who's like an associate in the mob or a main guy in the mob, that the rest of the family picks up the weight and takes care of the family. Like, if you talk to people that have been in the lifestyle and, we read their interviews, that's really not what happens. You're just by yourself, and you have to make money somehow to take care of your family. So, there's your good friends, watching out for your kids and your wife. And I thought the movie, like, it sticks pretty close to the story that Henry tells. Now we can argue about whether how truthful is Henry's story or not, but I mean, he doesn't make himself look like the greatest guy in the world. He doesn't make himself look really bad either. I tend to think that Henry, for the most part, is telling the truth.
Now, moving into when we talk about the stuff, whenever we talk about stuff that we don't like, I can't say that there's anything about this movie that I can say I don't like. I've racked my brain over it, and there's some things that I would love to see more of, but to say that I don't like, I can't think of anything.
Yeah, that's my opinion. Like I was thinking about it today in the last, I don't know, the last week or so, like things that I didn't like about Goodfellas, and I can't really think of anything I didn't like. I can think of things that I would have liked to have seen more, but I mean, the movie's already 2.5 hours, right? So I'm asking for a mini series, basically, is what I'm asking for, right? Which I think, I mean, Henry's story, I don't think it ever should be done because Goodfellas is such a classic, but I mean, you could do it. Like, just things I would have liked to have seen maybe a bit more about the Lufthansa heist, the point shaving scam. I would have liked to have them to show the life story of Jimmy more, in terms of like, his tragic upbringing. And Jimmy himself was just a very fascinating individual in terms of being like this cold, calculated murderer, yet he was extremely charismatic. Like the Gent is a very good nickname for him. And I would have liked to have seen a little bit more with Tommy, because apparently his uncle or something was like a capo or something in LA, but I couldn't really find much about that. And Tommy's got a really interesting story too, because they mentioned in the movie like his brother ended up becoming an informant, and that could explain why he had such a huge chip on his shoulder, and he felt like he needed to show that he was more mob than everybody else. And I would have liked to have seen them explore that a bit, but I mean, the movie's 2.5 hours already, right? So how much more could you add in?
One thing I would have liked to have seen is, and I think it could have made the movie even a little bit better, I think. I mean, I'd love to know what Martin Scorsese's thought process was. But Joe Pesci's character, Tommy DeVito, was a composite really of Paul Vario's son and Tommy DeSimone, because a lot of the things that they showed Henry Hill doing with Tommy DeSimone was really, he had done them with Paulie's son. And I think to show that dynamic of how really close Henry was in with that Paulie's son was practically his brother and Paul Vario's practically his dad, I think it would have shown that relationship of more between them all. And I think it would have been a lot more emotional, I think. And I wonder, I really would like to know if maybe one day when Marty comes on the show, he can talk about that. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, we're going to get him on. We've talked enough about the mob. He made his career off the mob, talking about the mob. We're kind of like brothers. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. My guess would be, I don't know, like if you added another actor in there, it would, I don't know, it would take away from the other actors. Maybe that was his line, because I thought that was interesting too. I'm like, I don't understand why they did it like that. I mean, it doesn't really take anything away from the movie, but like you pointed out, it could have maybe have made it better in terms of like just showing how close everybody was, right?
Maybe the one reason is so if maybe they make the composite character, but it's more like Paul Vario Jr., then it makes it, I think it was Paul Vario Jr., but for Paul Vario's son, then you have to show Paul's son killing Billy Bats to get that scene in. And then that makes it, I mean, especially if Paul's son's still alive, like it's almost slanderous to do that, or libelous, or whichever one it is. So I could see maybe they don't want to do that, but wouldn't it be interesting to see Joe Pesci playing that role as Paul's son, Paul Sorvino's son. That would have been kind of cool.
I mean, you could have kept Tommy in the movie too. I mean, in actuality, Tommy and Joe Pesci looked nothing alike. Like Tommy was a fairly large man. And he was a lot younger than Joe Pesci in the movie. I believe he was only 28 when he got whacked. So it shows you how young a lot of these guys were. Like, Henry's only 30. Tommy was only 28. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, who would you have had play Paul Vario's son?
I think I would have had it as Joe Pesci and either added another character of just somebody to play Tommy D. Simone, just basically to have that one scene with Billy killing Billy Bats, or just have it keep it as the composite character, but have it more leaning towards the Paul Vario side. I mean, it's a minor thing, but it could have been interesting. One other twist I think they could have done is to show that Stax Edwards wasn't just some dude who hung out with them. He was an integral part of their circle. I think, when they whack him at the end, it's just like, oh, that's just tying up a loose end. But it was devastating to Tommy because Tommy and Stax have been friends since high school. I think that to play that element out would have been really fun to see, that it really was more than killing Marty Krugman or any of the other guys who, Frenchie and all these other guys who wind up getting whacked. They were all pretty upset to have to kill Stax.
Yeah, none of them wanted to do it. And I mean, like you said, like Stax was he was like the credit card guy. He was apparently he was a wizard at stealing credit cards. That was his I guess that was his contribution to the Brown Lounge crew, which was what they called Jimmy's crew. Yeah, that would have been nice to have seen. I mean, he could have done it pretty quickly to show that Tommy and Stax were good friends. All they would have had to have taken is like Paul sits down Tommy and says like, oh, this is how you're going to get made or something. Or Jimmy says like, this is what Paul says. And Tommy's like, well, I've been friends with him since high school. I don't want to do that. Like, that's all I would have taken. I don't know why they didn't do that. And I don't know, it seems like an odd choice to me.
When Tommy does go and kill Stax, it's really cold-blooded. He just goes in, pops him. They make some jokes with Frankie Carbone, and then they leave. And so you don't really get that feeling come across at all. You get the exact opposite, that Tommy was just cold about it. It was another guy to whack, when it was really essentially whacking something close to his best friend.
I guess the logic behind it would have been, I mean, in the film it does work, and it's just depicting that Tommy is a complete and utter psychopath, right? That doesn't care about, I mean, and that is true for the most part. Like, Tommy didn't really care about killing anybody, really. He didn't want to kill Stax because he was friends with him, but anybody else, really, he didn't care. He would just murder them. I mean, that's from my reading, that's what comes across, and that's what Henry says and a bunch of other people say. And I guess that's, in the movie, they just wanted to show that, Tommy's just a ruthless killer.
Maybe for our wrap up here, I think the thing that, by reading about Lufthansa, reading Wise Guy, doing this research, the thing that really changed my perception of the movie is really Marty Krugman. Henry, the wig guy, if you watch it, I think without really knowing the background, then he just kind of looks like a classic schmuck hanger on. He just happened to fall into a good deal with knowing about this Lufthansa heist because he knew somebody at the airport. But you watch it again through a different lens, that Marty Krugman was absolutely critical to this, and he was a hardcore criminal himself with a really thick gambling book and a thick loan sharking book. He was one of them. And I think you watch it if you're watching it at first blush, you don't pick that up, but once you learn a little bit about it. I think at least for me, I looked at it from a different perspective and thought, yeah, Marty really was critical to all of this. And the movie does portray it that way, I think.
Well, he was dealing drugs out of that wig shop too. I know that sounds funny. It's like, oh, here's your wig and an ounce of coke or whatever he was selling. He was dealing drugs too. Not like a ton, but I mean, he was doing that too.
He was a crook.
He was more than it was a crook. He was more than just. He was an associate of the Lucchese family, right? Because he was Jewish, right? And then the movie, they don't really depict all of that. I mean, in the sense they want to make, I get it in terms of the movie because they want to make Marty seem sympathetic. So when Marty gets it, it depicts Jimmy as being like a monster. Mm-hmm. I mean, which Jimmy was.
Yeah.
That dynamic would kind of change if you see, Krugman like shaking down people and not paying their loan sharks. Their loans back and not paying their bets off. And, he's dealing cocaine to a bunch of teenagers or something out of the back of the wig shop or whatever he was doing. He's a little less sympathetic, right?
So we've got a lot more mob movies lined up for you. And I definitely, if you have some of your favorites that you'd like to hear us talk about and do a little background and then talk about the movie, just keep sending those movies in. We've got a lot of stuff settled, but we're always looking for more. Chris, it was enjoyable as always. I love talking about Goodfellas. I love talking about the Mafia. Yeah, we will definitely talk to you next time.